Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we're going to be considering a couple of different builds for you to take a look at prior to the upcoming 320 Forbidden Sanctum launch. Each of these are builds that have stood out to me and struck me as something that's either reliable or intriguing for the upcoming Forbidden Sanctum League. While normally I would just throw roughly between 4 to 10 builds at you and say, hey, here's some really solid build guides and some solid POBs and some solid introductions to playing a particular playstyle or archetype, today what we're going to do is something a little bit different. We're going to offer you some of these builds as considerations based on your own player motivations and your own player habits during League start. If you're new to the channel or you're returning after a long time hiatus like I am, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. There are 4 categories that I have broken down what happens to me when I League start and what I've observed amongst other players when they League start during an opening weekend of a new patch for Path of Exile. Into each of these 4 categories, I've placed some build recommendations based on where you might fall, and I've put these build recommendations there because I might fall into those spots. So in a strange way, I'm only giving you advice, the same sort of advice that I would give myself if I fall into one of these 4 different categories here for a new league. The first category of players is a category of players that like to level with their build's endgame skill. These are the sorts of players who, when they boot up Path of Exile, they say, look, I would like to be using the skill that I'm eventually going to play as early as possible. They don't want to get used to a playstyle A when they know that their build is going to transition into a playstyle B. They just want to be able to go with B as early as possible. We're going to give you a couple of recommendations that essentially allow you to level as early as possible with your endgame skill. A second category are players who like to level fast and then swap to something else. In contrast to Group 1 or Category 1, while some players really like to level with their endgame skill, some players don't care about that. Some players are used to leveling, using what's fast to get them through the 10x story campaign, and then switch to whatever their main skill is going to be once they hit maps. Second category and build recommendations are going to be for you. Thirdly, some players like to give themselves flexibility to reroll, like maybe the same class, but using a different ascendancy. Oftentimes, what will happen over the opening weekend of a Path of Exile League launch is that one particular build will get used for leveling through the campaign and starting into maps and maybe even starting to take down some bosses, but then everybody will notice that there's a shift in the meta or there's a particular build that's within inside your class archetype with a different ascendancy that's maybe more powerful. So you'll use build A in order to farm currency to then switch or move over or transition into build B, which is going to be smoother or allow you to accomplish the goals that you've set out for the league in a better, more fun and exciting fashion. Then there's Category 4, which is some players just like to try new things. And so we'll give you a recommendation on that. Maybe something that you haven't tried before. Maybe it's something some of you have tried. But if you've never tried it before and you want to try something new, yeah, it's pretty fun. You're going to need a machine that can handle it, though. Our first category is players who like to level with their build's endgame skill. This is a build that I've played and League started in the past. It looks like it's still going to be strong for 320, and so I'm recommending for you today, or rather encouraging you to consider, the following Shack Central's Cold Dot Occultist. In terms of build guides on the forums or build guides in Path of Building, this is one of the premier builds out there. I think the only build guide that has ever in the history of Path of Exile builds been able to claim to be more exhaustive, more comprehensive, more encyclopedic as a build guide in its presentation is maybe Enki's Arc Witch, and really that has fallen off the map, at least from what I've been able to tell over the last 2 years or so, and Shack Central's then has taken over as the single most exhaustive explanation of a build guide out there. If you're a new player, if you've never played a build before and you want to know exactly how to go from day one where you're at with all the different tools that you could ever possibly dream of using and all the different options that could be available to you in a build, then this is going to be the build guide for you. If you don't want to be overwhelmed and confused with doing A option and then transitioning to B option and then C option for your end game, again, this is going to be for you. Shack Central has set up this particular build guide to be able to allow you to, as soon as you can, integrate into your build the gems that you are going to use in its final form as you are leveling through the 10-act story campaign. The essential changes for the 320 patch cycle are as follows by Shack Central. He writes, the Malediction and Profane Bloom Ascendancy nodes on the Occultist have been changed. Malediction has been renamed to Unholy Authority and no longer gives increased curse effect or the Malediction debuff. It still gives +1 curse and has inherited the your hexes can affect hexproof enemies from Profane Bloom. There are no build changes due to this update. You will be able to take slightly more damage from the removal of Malediction, but you don't have to worry about hexproof enemies anymore. A moment ago, I made the claim that this is the most comprehensive build guide out there, and it's true on the forums. It's also true in Path of Building. When it comes to your leveling tree, there's lots of different options for you. Down here at the bottom of your Path of Building link, Shack Central has essentially divided up the tree into several different categories, whether you're playing trade, whether you're playing SSF, whether you are leveling in Acts 1 through 2, whether you're leveling at Acts 3 and 4, going through your first and second lab, whether you're towards the end of your Kitava run in Acts 9 and 10. He's got several different leveling trees for you to consider, whether you're in trade, whether you're in SSF, and he does the same thing for the itemization, whether or not you're in SSF and you're starting your end game, if you're in SSF, and what you should be aiming for in the late game. He's got notes for all this stuff. Look at this. Here's an example on the boots. This is what you're looking for. Your required mods are armor and energy shield, movement speed. Other good mods to be looking for: elemental, chaos resistance, dex, strength, and ES recharge. Some good eldritch implicits. He's got everything on here. If you're wondering, hey, what do I need in this particular item slot? There's going to be a recommendation based on the way how you're playing Path of Exile, whether it's in a trade league, such as the following example of an item set, League Starter with Spine of the First Claimant, or if you're in SSF, or if you're in late game, early game. He's got setups and recommendations for everything. He's got specific recommendations in the notes about playing either trade or SSF in this build, exactly what to look for in each item slot, exactly what to consider in each gem slot, what to look for in cluster jewels, what to look for essentially as you're leveling if you're having different difficulties as you're progressing through the 10-act story campaign or as you hit maps. There's included in here also recommendations for vendor recipes. This is like the definitive build guide. If every build guide looked like this, I think a lot more players would want to play Path of Exile. They would at least feel like they could play Path of Exile. They could go from a day 0 all the way up through a high, let's say level 90 character in whatever version of Path of Exile they're playing, whether it's SSF or in Trade League. So as a League starter, this is why this takes #1 spot. This takes the cake. It's beautiful. It's glorious. If you've never played it before, or if you've never followed a guide before that's got this level of depth to it, you are seriously missing out. The second category that I've noticed myself, what I fall into during League Starter weekends, and I've noticed others in Guild as well as the wider Path of Exile community can sometimes fall into, is I want to level fast, but then I want to swap to something else. I want to use whatever's good to level, but then I know that I'm going to need to swap to another build later on down the line, another skill, another ascendancy possibly, and so I want to be able to transition that well and be guided through that transition experience with a particular build guide. 2 recommendations for you today: LOLshe's EA Raider and Kobe Black Mamba's Poisonous Concoction Venom Geyer Deadeye. We're going to start by taking a look at LOLshe's Explosive Arrow Raider. So what struck me about LOLshe's guide was here was a player who is willing to say that they're a bad mechanical player. And I'm a terrible mechanical player at any kind of video game that requires any kind of reaction time. If the game requires you to be able to have more of a reaction time than a dead snail, I'm probably bad at it. And here's LOLshe saying, look, I'm a bad player. I think my mechanical skill is something like 5 out of 10. My game knowledge is 4 out of 10, and my build creation is about 1 out of 10. That being said, I think he's being a little bit humble there. He's got the definitive guide on how to level and progress and make currency early on in a league by using heist. There's a ton of early ways to exploit heist in order to make currency early on in a trade league environment, and there is no better place for you to go to learn how to level quickly, not progress your atlas, but to get into heists and do endless heists very quickly to generate a ton of currency early on than this build guide from LOLshe. It will take you through the leveling process, get you into doing endless heists and blueprints and making tons and tons of currency that then you can use to fund a transition to another build or to another particular skill gem that you'd like to play later on in the league. The build guide creator says, "My goal is to create a heist compendium for all players so that you don't need to search all over the internet for some useful info about it. And I can tell you, reading through this particular guide, I have learned things about heist, even though I used heist way back when heist came out during its first league cycle, and I made a ton of currency off of it. I think probably my best character ever that I ever made came out during the heist cycle. That being said, I've learned things from reading and from interacting with this build guide here over the last week about heist and the heist strategy of just doing endless heists and making early league profits by playing heist." LOL, she's very, very interactive with those who drop comments and ask questions on the forum guide. So I encourage you, if you've got questions or you've got thoughts, simply head on over to the forum guide and drop a question. He's also got a YouTube channel as well where I introduced myself, let him know I'd be recommending the build guide, and he was kind enough to respond there. So very, very highly interactive build guide creator and is happy to interact with folks and their questions. Here's what he said as a comparison of a guide for Toxic Rain Pathfinder that Ziz had come out with. He says, "This build should feel better in general for PoE," meaning Ziz's build should feel better in general for PoE since it's got all the progression and stuff. But it will be much slower than a dedicated heister. Now listen to this. If you want speed as you are leveling through the 10x story campaign and as you get into your heists, just listen to this comparison. And I mean, quote, way slower. Ziz's tree has got almost zero movement speed, putting him at a puny 27%, while we are rocking 194% movement speed on Lulshi's build. Now, to be fair, he's got more deeps and effective HP, and so it is a better overall character. But if you just want a league start, you just want to zoom, you just want to get to where you want to go, then this particular build is a strong option for you to consider. Another poster asked the question, how does Explosive Arrow feel compared to Toxic Rain? This is the response from Lulshi. IMO EA feels better at lower levels since damage gets out faster and damage is actually a tiny bit better. I do advise switching to Toxic Rain though if you want to do some blueprints and level I-83 heists and actually have a character that can do tier 16 maps. But for now, this thread is mostly focused on endless heists in terms of POBs and in terms of DPS, effective HP, etc. So if you're looking to level something quickly and then transition to something else, this is going to be a great build guide for you. Second recommendation for those of you who fall into the category where you want to level with one thing and then swap to something else later is Kobe Black Mamba's Venom Gyre Deadeye. Now this actually levels with Poisonous Concoction, and then he's got a build recommendation and a strategy for transitioning into Venom Gyre. We all know by now that Venom Gyre actually has a Vaal version that is coming out in 320 Forbidden Sanctum. So if you're interested in playing Venom Gyre and you want to get to a spot where it's going to feel great for that moment of transition, then Poisonous Concoction might be a way to do it. And there's a wonderfully fast way to get there. That's taking advantage of all the tailwind speed that you get from Deadeye. In the video that's going to be linked down below in the video description along with the POB, Kobe Black Mamba simply answers the question, why level with Poisonous Concoction? He's got a couple of reasons. One, it requires almost no gear and you use your life flasks as a weapon. During a league start environment, that is incredibly valuable for you to be able to go, look, I'm not interested in weapons. I'm not interested in scaling up X, Y, and Z. All I need to do is depend on essentially vendor recipes in order to scale my damage, and then my gem levels themselves will actually scale up my damage as I'm progressing my way through the 10x story campaign. That's what Poisonous Concoction allows you to do. Kobe's path of building is also outstanding. Really like the way how he's got things up on the tree. You can simply switch from what act you're in. Are you in Act 1? This is what it should look like. Act 2, the masteries and the keystones that you're going to be eventually aiming for. Act 3, Act 4, and so on until you get to your Venom Gyre respec. When you respec over to Venom Gyre, exactly what your tree is going to look like and exactly how many orbs you're going to need to use in order to respec your tree, orbs of regret, you know, those are relatively pricey early on in a league. They can be, depending on where you're at. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of time early on in a league when you're trying to progress quickly and gather currency quickly. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of your currency on a respec. So if you don't want to have to spend maybe any extra currency on respecking your character or transitioning from Poisonous Concoction, over to Venom Gyre, then this is going to be a wonderful tree showing you how you can respec from your Poisonous Concoction setup into a later on Venom Gyre setup, and then what sort of endgame tree you're actually going to be looking at, along with the sorts of skills that you're going to look at. So the skill configuration that he's got set up here is leveling Act 1 or levels 1 through 12, and then level 12 through the end of the campaign as you're using Poisonous Concoction. So if you want something that's maybe a little bit more well-rounded than, let's say, Lolshi's Speedster that's just going to run as fast as it can, then this is the build that I would recommend for you if you're looking to transition from one particular build to another. Just use Poisonous Concoction. Even if you're not going to play it as a Deadeye, there's plenty of other ascendancies or character classes that could actually take advantage of Poisonous Concoction and use a basic Poisonous Concoction layout on the right-hand side of the tree and then transition away from it later on once you hit maps or once you hit your desired spot for where you want to transition to whatever skill you'd like to use in the end game. Maybe you're in the third category of players, which I've noticed sometimes happens to me, where you're playing a particular build and you go, you know what, this build was fine for a little bit, but I'm actually kind of just feeling something different. In other words, you're playing a build that you know you want to have the flexibility to re-roll with. This is for players who essentially are looking at a build guide, are looking at a particular approach or a strategy and going, you know what? I've seen a bunch of different videos. I've seen a bunch of discussions. I've looked at the forums. I've combed Reddit. I've went through YouTube. I've taken a look at the people who I trust, and I still really can't make a decision on what I want to play. A lot of people are in that boat come league start. It was a meme and still continues to be every single league start that like 5 minutes before league, everybody in guild chat is going, what are you playing? What are you playing on Discord or Voiced or wherever it is that people are hanging out? What is it that you're actually going to play? I don't know. Once the league actually comes up and I have to choose a character, I guess I'll pick. So if that sounds like you, if you want to have the flexibility to re-roll to something else that's going to be strong, to another build that's probably going to emerge in the meta as relatively strong, then one class to consider is going to be the Witch. And the character for you to level with, maybe for a time, that's even been featured in Build of the Week officially by Grinding Gear Games, is Devon's Frostblink Elementalist. Yes, you heard it right. There is a build that allows you to use Frostblink as your primary way of dealing out ignite damage. It sounds crazy, and I was intrigued to watch the video, to read through the guide, and go, oh my goodness, this is actually league start interesting and viable through the Elementalist's ability to scale ignite. So Devon has named this the Hot Stepper. It is the Frostblink Elementalist, and right from the get-go, Devon says, I know I'm not the first one to make this build, so I don't claim to be the first one. I'm simply making a comprehensive forum guide as per the request from a follower, and it is comprehensive. As soon as I read the title of this particular forum guide, I went, what? How on earth can you possibly make this work? And thankfully, through Devon's clear communication in the build guide posted on the forums, as well as through some video demonstrations, you can actually get a sense for how you can go from day 0 league start into the endgame version of this build where you're dealing 5 million damage over time DPS. Now, when I first looked at this build guide, I thought, okay, it sounds crazy. It sounds very interesting. It sounds, frankly, unique. It sounds like something I haven't necessarily played before, and so it might be a little bit risky. And when anything sounds risky like this, it means it's going to depend heavily on uniques, right? And so I thought there's no way that this could be league starter viable. Now, there are some uniques that are going to make it helpful for you as you're leveling. So if you're in an SSF environment, probably not going to be as friendly as if you're in a trade league environment. But here's what Devon writes for Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Act 1, highly recommend using 1,000 Ribbons Robe. Believe it or not, here's a build that actually can use a unique that can drop early on because as a 4-link, it provides Ignite Proliferation. You want to get Frostblink up onto level 4. You want to support it with Life Tap and added Lightning, added Cold. So essentially you got Frostblink, Life Tap, and then either added Lightning or added Cold, and that's going to be your early Act 1 build. Then in Act 2, you're going to take Herald of Ice, and you're going to try and scale up with Defiance Banner. You can trade for this in a trade league environment, or if you're SSF, you can always mule this over with a Marauder, Templar, or Duelist if you really need to. 4-link setup in Act 2 is going to be Frostblink, Life Tap, Cold to Fire, and Combustion. Then Act 3 is where you're going to equip the aura for Hatred, so your aura should look like the following: Hatred, Herald of Ice, and Defiance Banner. Once you get your normal lab in Act 3, you can respec all chance to ignite nodes on the POB and on the recommended tree because you now have ignite up 100% of the time. In Act 3, you've got 100% ignite. That's insane. At least for me, as I was first looking at the build guide and thought, okay, how can you actually level with this and make this happen? The hard part is going to be actually getting your Ignite going. Well, you can actually level with it and be relying on Ignite. I thought this was going to be a build where it was essentially, all right, level with one thing, and then once you hit level 80 and you got the right uniques, you can really transition to what the build is. No, you can actually approach this build early on from Act Level 3 using the skills and the style of play that you're going to use for the rest of the game. And worst case scenario, if you don't enjoy it, or you don't like it, or it's not scaling to the positions that you'd like it to scale in the end game, you're still playing as a witch, and you can pivot into either a necromancer or an occultist, or some other version of an elementalist that's going to allow you to continue to scale your damage and play. I will say this, before you swap off this build too soon, this build can take on tier 16 maps. He's got video guides and proof and video evidence showing it. It's nuts. Well, I said early on in the video that there would be a fourth category that might be available for some players who want to try some new things. If you have never leveled or league started or played at all with Flicker Strike, there has never been a better time to do so than now. And if you want to play with a build guide that is going to take you from level 0 all the way through to you're finally being able to use Flicker Strike right around level 28 is where Holly Phantom recommends it, then there is no better, more comprehensive build guide to walk you through how to play and level with Flicker Strike than Holly Phantom's Flicker Strike Slayer. If you would like to play Path of Exile, just pressing your finger down on one button, and maybe pretending as though while you're doing so that you're pressing a roulette wheel, and potentially the roulette wheel is going to take you to the roulette wheel of doom, or maybe the roulette wheel of loot, then Flicker Strike is going to be for you, and thankfully Grinding Gear Games has obliged all the sorts of fanboys of Flicker Strike that are out there, or the wannabe fanboys of Flicker Strike out there, with the invention and the institution of Vaal Flicker Strike, now going to be available to us in the 320 Forbidden Sanctum League. In other words, if you've always wanted to try Flicker Strike, but you've never known if just pressing one button and hoping and watching and waiting to see what happens is exactly the right playstyle for you, then there has never been a better time for you to try and find out if your machine can actually handle Flicker Strike or not. By the way, one word of disclaimer, and I don't want anybody shouting at me that I didn't warn them, this is not going to be a hardcore recommended build. You gonna die on this a lot. With the inauguration of Vaal Flicker Strike now into the game in 320, Holly Phantom has given us some very quick insights onto what this does for the build and why is it that it actually makes it easier to level early on in the 10Act story campaign of Path of Exile now more than ever. Why is it easier now that we've got Vaal Flicker Strike? Well, it used to be that Vaal Flicker Strike struggled in a couple of areas. One of them was, of course, on regular Flicker Strike, just with bosses. So, with the new invention of Vaal Flicker Strike, we've got a couple of things going for us, including the gem itself and on the passive tree. So, we've got Vaal Flicker Strike, which is going to help against bosses. We've got Melee Splash now available on the tree in the lower left corner, which is rather easy for us as a duelist and as a slayer to go get. So you no longer need to use the gem Melee Splash support. That's big. That's going to be an improvement in our gem slot availability and options. And it's pretty expensive to anoint, so you just path over to get it early on during a league start. Nobody wants to have to use their anointing oils and spend their currency grabbing something that they could grab otherwise on the passive tree. Lastly, +1 strike target is on the attack mastery, and it is an additional source of some clear speed. So, if you just want to press down one button and you want to see where the game decides to take you, then Vaal Flicker Strike and leveling with it through the 10Act story campaign has never been easier, more exciting, and potentially more self-fun and self-frustrating at the same time as 320 Forbidden Sanctum. Holly Phantom's POB is another great looking POB with multiple different leveling trees featured, showing level 28 with Melee Splash +1 strike and Life Leech, then what do you do at level 40 when you get Frenzy on hit ×2, and then eventually at level 65 when you've got Fortify, Onslaught, Precise Technique. Then moving on from there, there's endgame versions of the build that are also discussed throughout the forum guide, and so you can reference those particular recommendations throughout the forum guide as you level your character or as you're evaluating the build and taking a look for yourself. All the information again for the POB and for the forum guide for all of these particular guides that we've discussed today as considerations for you to think about for your league start are available down below in the video description. Well, thanks so much for watching and for joining us today as we discussed a couple of different considerations, some builds for you to think about as you are going in, and maybe even beyond that, maybe hopefully what this discussion can do for you is it can let you think about what sort of player you are as you approach league start. Are you in any one of the 4 categories? Maybe you're recognizing your own patterns where you constantly maybe start with one particular character and one ascendancy and then you like to swap, or maybe you'd prefer to simply level with the same gem that you always play with, or maybe you're constantly checking PoE Ninja and seeing what's emerging as the dominant meta skill and you'd like to swap over to that and maybe make your build fit into that. Anyway, hopefully those categories are helpful to you as you prepare for league start. I'd love to hear down below in the comments what you're league starting for the upcoming weekend, and then whether or not you're going to use a skill or ascendancy that you've played before. Thanks again for joining us for today's discussion. I look forward to responding to each of your comments down below, and as always, I hope the upcoming 320 Forbidden Sanctum League is the league a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.